Welcome back to another video tutorial with Mrs. Warner, and today I'm going to show you some of the things that I sent you in your painting kit for acrylic painting. So we've done a lot of watercolor and now we're switching over to acrylic paint. So you should have received a box when you open it up that has a whole bunch of different paints in it. I'll go through that in a second. A bag with 4 brushes, 2 flat brushes, 2 round brushes, and then an envelope that has 2 canvas boards in it. One will have plastic on it, one will not. We're going to save these for our project, so just set these aside for a later time. Now let's talk about your brushes and your paint. First of all, with your brushes, you should have watched the video on how to clean out your brushes. It is very important, very, very important that you clean out these brushes really, really, really well. If you leave any paint that is in there, it is going to dry, and acrylic paint is permanent. So once it dries, it's permanent, it turns into plastic. If it's stuck in the brushes, then we've ruined the brushes and we have to replace them. We can't save them, we have to replace them. So make sure that when you are cleaning your brushes out that you're using some soap. I know he used a brush soap, but you can just use any type of soap, a kitchen soap, a shampoo, dish detergent, whatever it is, and make sure that you're really scraping those brushes around in your hand to get everything out of the middle. Clean them very well, super important, and right away. Also, please do not leave your brushes sitting in water. That will loosen the glue that is on the inside and then the bristles will fall out. So take care of your brushes. By the way, I do need these 4 brushes returned to me. If I do not get them returned, I will have to charge you from school. So please make sure I get these back. We use them for other classes. So that's what's in the bag. Your paints, you have 10 little cups of paint, which is way more than you actually need. And then I also put some popsicle sticks in there so you can scoop out the paint and you don't have to contaminate with your brush by getting a different color brush and trying to scoop out paint. So use the popsicle sticks to scoop out the paint, and there should be 10, one for each color. The colors that you have in here, we have a red, orange, a yellow, a green. You have 2 different blues, a lighter blue and a darker blue, a violet purple, black, and then 2 whites. We use a lot of white, so that's why I gave you 2 whites. Now, one thing to know about the acrylic paint is it is permanent, so please do not paint in any clothes that you do not want to get paint on. And also, I'd really recommend putting newspaper or a barrier down on your table so you don't have to get paint anywhere where your parents are not going to be happy about that. Couple of things that I have from my house that I am using. I just grabbed a plastic cup to put water in it. I have some paper towels, a couple of them, so I can clean off my brushes. And then I just grabbed a paper plate. I'm going to use that to mix my paint on. The watercolor paint you mix right in the lid of the paint tray. This I'm going to use a paper plate because I can throw it away when I'm done, mix it up. You know, I don't need to do it to save it or anything. I also have a paper plate that has kind of a plastic coating on it. It's not like paper because that's just going to soak up the paint and you're going to waste paint that way. So if you have one that has a plastic coating, cool. If you use dishes, just make sure you wash them right away. The paint's non-toxic. Don't eat it, but it'll be okay if you use your dishes. Another thing I want you to note about these paint cups is that you do need to keep the lids back on the paint. They will dry out. So if you leave them sitting out without the lid or not covered up, then they are going to dry out pretty quickly and then they'll be hard and you can't use them anymore. Also, would not maybe be a bad idea to put them in a Ziploc bag and try and get out as much air as possible. So if you want, grab another Ziploc. I don't know if they'll fit in here maybe, but if you seal them up, they will stay better for you longer. You'll also want to make sure that you're wiping off your popsicle sticks as you use them, or else they're going to just really get gunked up with dry paint and then it's kind of done. So you have to turn it around and use the other end or throw it away, and you don't have that many. So, a couple other things that I pulled in for these painting techniques is what we use for some of the watercolors. I have my toothbrush so I can splatter, the sponge, again I have the scrubby, but any type of sponge will do. I've got the paper clip so I can work with Sgraffito. Some of these techniques are going to be very similar to what you've done with watercolor, and some of them are going to be a little bit different. In your sketchbook, I want you to create these boxes of the different techniques. So similar to the techniques we did in watercolor, this time you're going to do acrylic painting techniques. And I have 14 different techniques I am going to share with you. So take some time, pause the video, and copy this chart onto 2 pages in your sketchbook. The first technique I'm going to show you is a dry brush technique, and I'm going to scoop a little bit of paint out, you don't need a lot, onto my plate. So there's the blue, set that off to the side. I'm going to use a couple of different colors, so I'll scoop out a little bit of green as well. And I'll also use a little white. By the way, this white is very, very strong. It's a blockout white, meaning that it's very opaque and not a lot is going to get through it. With my brushes, I like the flat brush, this biggest flat brush, probably the best. It covers areas, bigger areas really nicely. This is probably the one I use the most because I can get really wide areas and I can turn it sideways and get really skinny areas. The round brushes are fine as well. Take these little plastic things off. You don't need them on there. By the way, if your brushes are really stiff initially, that's just some sizing or some starch in it. They'll be fine. Just play with them a little bit, they'll be fine. So this is probably my favorite brush. Unlike watercolor, I am not going to add water to my paint. I'm going to keep it right from the tray itself. So don't stick a whole bunch of water and really water them down. Keep them really nice and solid like they came. I can get a little bit of water on my brush. So I've got my cup of water here, just a little bit of water, but I'm going to dry that off. And it's really just to get the brush moist so the paint flows a little better, but I'm not adding any water. Dry brush, just like watercolor, I'm going to pick up some paint on my brush, not a lot. I'm going to really take off as much as I possibly can, and I'm going to create lines on my paper. So the surface quality of the paper is really what is showing through, and that is what I'm looking for. If I want just a little bit more, I can do that. Doesn't matter what direction you're painting, I'm just going all the same direction. Going to rinse out my brush. Start with a different color. And just layer on more colors. The nice thing about dry brush is that you can really layer up some colors to get some really cool textures. Let's get a little bit of white. So the nice idea of that dry brush is that it's creating a lot of quality and a lot of texture, especially when you get to the canvas board, which has a very, very rough texture to it. When you look at it, you'll be able to get some really nice textures on there. My next technique is sgraffito. And with the sgraffito, I'm going to create a wash of a color, just like you did with watercolor. I'm just using the orange. I'm not contaminating it, so I don't need to scoop it out. I'm not mixing it. I'm just going to create an undersurface that is one solid color, so orange. And then I'm going to let that orange dry. And acrylic paint takes about, depending on the surface, if it's really thick, it'll take about 20-30 minutes to dry. If it's pretty thin, it might take 5 to 10 minutes to dry. So let that dry. And now that that is dry, I'm going to come back with another color, probably a darker color. I'll use the blue. You'll notice that some of the paints are a little bit more translucent, so when you paint on top, you're going to see through it, which is fine. But I'm going to put another color, a darker color on top. I'm going to paint kind of thick with this one. Try and cover it up a little bit more. Very similar to that wash technique. And now I can use either the back of my brush and I can scratch into it to reveal what is underneath, or the color that is underneath. I can also use something if I want more detail, like a paper clip, so it's a really skinny line, or the other side of the paper clip if I want something wider. But anything that you can use. But please be careful where you put these after you scratch them off. You will definitely want to wipe them down. Also really great for creating textures. If I'm creating fur of an animal, you can do an underpainting, that color underneath, and then put another color on top and scratch into it. The technique of scumbling is really how you move your brush. Instead of doing really long layers, you're doing little tiny short movements. So I've switched to the smaller brush, and I'm going to pick up the green. I don't need to wipe it off, I'm not doing dry brush. And scumbling is about going back and forth and creating lots of different variety of thicknesses of paint. So I can go all one direction, back and forth. You can see that starts to create some lines. I can work with circles. You can see the brush stroke. So it's about the idea of the brush stroke. And again, with scumbling, like any of these other techniques, I can pick up another color. I can layer it on top. It doesn't matter if the paint is dry or wet. If I'm taking the paint from my plate as opposed to in the containers, then they'll start to mix right on the canvas or right on the paper, and you can get new colors that way. The technique of cross-hatching is a variation of the scumbling. I'm just moving the brush in X's, like going across and changing my directions with my paint. And as I pick up new colors, again, if I'm taking it from my tray, I don't need to really wash out my brush in between, because they're going to mix on the paper or on your canvas anyway. So I'm creating brush strokes going in a variety of directions. The trick with cross-hatching or scumbling is you don't want the layers to dry in between, and it's really about trying to create texture and variety. So here I've got the red and the yellow. Yellow is very, very transparent, so as I mix it, trying to get thicker yellow to help create yellow highlights, mix it with the red, leave some of the red, and then create more of an orange as well. But don't let your paint dry in between, because then you're just layering, which is the one right below it. Sometimes with acrylic paint, you'll want to paint thicker. Watercolor is about watering it down and painting thin. Acrylic, you need to paint thicker. Go back and layer more in. And if I want to add some variety of value, I can always go back and add some white to it. Again, don't overblend, don't mix it too much, because if I mix too much, then it's just one solid mass of color, and that's no fun. So as it's still wet, add a variety in there, and then I can get lights and darks, not in too many places. This technique is great for creating backgrounds. If you're working with a still life and you don't want just a solid color black background, which you really should never have, this is a great way to add some variety, but not too much. The next technique is an overlay or a glaze, and this is where I'm laying a color down. Again, probably a darker color. Let's do the green, and then I'll also add some yellow. And I'm going to make more of a stripe pattern in here. Just create some diagonal lines. And I'm going to let that dry. Once that is dry, I can go in with another color. I'll go in with the yellow that doesn't have the red in it. Yellow, orange, the violet are very translucent, transparent colors. So you're going to have a really hard time trying to cover things up with these colors, which is kind of nice because then I can go back and overlap, and it's creating, like the watercolor paint did, it is creating a little bit more of a second color. I can overlap the yellow and the green and get a new color, more of the yellowy green. If I truly want my yellow to be solid and very, very opaque and I'm not seeing the color underneath, if I mix that yellow right on my tray with some of that white, first of all, it makes a lighter version of yellow, but it's also going to create a more opaque white. So when I paint now on top, it's going to cover a little bit better, and it's not necessarily as transparent. If you keep layering that on, eventually, like let the layers dry in between and layer it on, it will take quite a few, but eventually it will be back to that solid yellow color. Layering is our next technique, and with layering, similar to the cross hatching, but this time I'm going to really overblend and mix my paint directly on my paper. Now a lot of times I will want to pre-mix my color or close to the color that I want right on my palette or on my plate, but in this case sometimes I can mix it right on the paper. I would highly recommend mixing mostly on your plate before you get to your canvas, because trying to get the right combination is not always so easy. I'm going to start by painting red. Again, paint kind of thick so it stays wet. You don't want it to dry out too quickly. And then I pick up, I'll mix my orange, the yellow right on top. As opposed to the technique where I was doing the cross hatching, I want to blend it so that it becomes one solid color. That is one way to mix directly on your canvas. Now the problem with this is that it tends to spread out. It's really great if you're doing a nice blend in a background for a sky, a large area, but if you're trying to do a smaller area, you'll definitely want to mix it on your tray. The next technique I'm showing you is working with the sponging technique. So just like watercolor, I have my sponge here that is just really a green scrubby, or like any kind of sponge will do. But when you're doing the sponge technique, please make sure that you're washing your sponge out right away. If you don't, it is going to dry in there and it's going to set and stain. So I am going to, again, layer a couple of different colors. I'm going to start with my blue, get just a little bit on there, and try and get as much off as possible, like that dry brush technique. And really just light sponging, light taps are going to be a great thing. You can layer on as much as you need to, so if I need it to be darker, then I can always add more. If I want to mix the colors, then I can go ahead and get my next color and overlap them while they are still wet. Remember, try to change the direction. Don't always go the same way. And you can add as much or as little as you need to. So, and the nice thing with sponging is it creates that nice texture as well. If you get really chunky paint like I did with the green and the red, then you are going to get big blobs. But if you really kind of sponge it off or dry it off a little bit first, then you'll get these really nice little spots. Similar to the sponging technique is what I call the dabbing technique. And it's similar to sponging. It's this time I'm using my brush. Now when I use the brush, I don't want to like flatten it. I don't want to splay the bristles out like weird. That's really bad for the bristles. Like when you're cleaning it, it's good, but then you kind of smooth it back out. But when you're painting with it, that's not so great. So with the dabbing technique, I am taking the brush and it's almost like stabbing the paper. Keep changing the direction. It's just a good variety, just like sponging. And I am bending the bristles, but I'm not letting them like spread out. This is a great technique if I put more space in between. Really good technique for doing trees and bushes. And here I will add some yellow. And if you're doing this when it's wet, then your colors will mix together and you'll create new colors. So my yellow, my blue make the green. This is also a fantastic technique for clouds. If you are trying to create clouds on something, and I'll pick up some white. And if I have the blue and the white mixing together, then I'm going to get a great variety of lights and darks and colors for clouds. Again, it creates a texture, and at the same time, it also mixes the paint. Another thing you can do with dabbing is if you don't necessarily want to use your paintbrush, painting with Q-tips are also a really nice thing to do. You can, again, just kind of stab the paper, dot the paper. It also creates more of a dot texture, and it takes a little bit longer to do, but that is another technique that you can use for that dabbing technique. Pick up some white. The splatter painting, when I'm doing splatter paint, at this time I do want to get some water and water the paint down just a little bit more because it's a little weird if it's super thick. I'm going to use some clean water as opposed to like dirty water. So I'm just going to get my toothbrush wet that I'm using, pick up some paint, and this is going to get all over your hand, so be aware of that. But same thing, I am going to just spread it. And it's a good way, once that dries, again, to create some really interesting and unique textures. So let's wash that out. The masking technique is done just like it was with the watercolor, where I'm taking some tape. You can cut any size, shape, whatever you want. Since I have a bigger area, I am going to keep this more solid. And I'm just going to put that down on the paper. If I want it to be nice and clean and straight, then I would have cut edges as opposed to torn edges. And cover up whatever area you want to mask out or not paint. In this case, I am going to just take my paint, paint around it, paint over it. I can change colors halfway through if I want. Doesn't really matter. And then once that paint dries, you can go back and peel it off. My paint's not quite dry yet, but that's okay. Just peel that off, and you can see exactly where the tape was. Now it did bleed under a little bit. I can always go back with one of the brushes and clean up the edges if I need to, if it need it to be nice and solid. There we go, masking. The soft edge versus the hard edge is really about how you are painting. If I am trying to create a nice, solid, clean edge, then I will definitely want to use my brush and create a nice solid line. So it's how I'm brushing. I'm going to create a nice clean edge line as I am painting. So as opposed to like going back and forth or kind of trying to create little lines with it, that is going to create a softer edge, but a nice clean solid stroke is really important. If I wanted it to be that soft edge, again, just kind of that technique of doing little bits at a time. Another good way for that is to take a brush, which I don't have any paint on, and I'm just going to pull some of that extra paint, that wet paint, onto it's almost like that scumbling going back and forth, onto the paper, and it is going to help smooth it out and blend it out. It's going to thin it, and it's also going to help smooth it a little bit. So the hard edge, nice and clean, slow stroke, soft edge, more of that scumbling, and then maybe blend it with a dry brush. Now I'm going to show you a couple of ways to blend the paint. So if I want to go from one color into another color or one color lighter, there's a couple of ways to do this. If I want to blend right on my paper or right on my canvas, I can do it this way by creating an area on one side that has my blue. Clean the brush out. On the other side, very close to it, I am going to put another color. In this case, I will put the yellow. So I'm painting them really side by side, fairly solid colors. Paint kind of thick. You want to have enough paint on there. If you paint too thin, it's just going to dry really quick and not work. And then I'm taking a brush that has no paint on it, not any water or anything, and then I'm just going to simply go back and forth and blend the two together to make my new color. So I'm doing almost like an Xing crossing technique, and then I'm going across as if I were creating a wash, and that is going to help blend those two together. And I pulled more yellow into the blue. If I went the opposite way, I would pull more blue into the yellow, but creates almost a distinct line. I could go back and blend a little bit more with that, but that is one way to get it to blend from one into the other. Another technique for blending together, again I'll use the blue and the yellow, is by gradually adding another color. In this case I'm going to start with my lighter color, which is my yellow. And I'm just going to simply paint my stripe. I'm using a smaller brush for this because I'll want to add just a little bit at a time. If I use a bigger brush, it's more for a bigger area. So smaller areas, smaller brush. Again, make sure that you have enough paint that it's not going to dry too quickly. Then I'm simply going to pick up a tiny bit, not very much, just a tiny, tiny bit of blue, and I'm going to start processing that in. And then I can pick up a little bit more. And then I pick up a little bit more. You don't want to keep going up and down and back and forth, because the more that you do that, the more it's going to even it out, and then the whole thing will end up being the same color. And I'm also painting, it looks like I have yellow on the brush, but the opposite side is blue. So make sure that you're painting with the same side of the brush all the time as well. And I'm getting just a little bit of yellow in there, so if I wanted to wipe that off, now that I'm getting down to the more solid blue. Okay, so it's not necessarily as quick of a blend. This is a way to get a really quick blend from the blue into the yellow. This one is going to take a little bit longer. And now that I have my basic blend, I've wiped off most of the paint, I can go back and help to smooth it out a little bit. Notice when I do that, I go from top to bottom or light to dark. If I keep going back and forth, again, it just kind of mashes it all together. Another thing I can do with these blends is on my tray, I can mix my colors together and then do this blend. So I can start with my yellow, I can mix in my green color, my blue and my yellow. Not a very pretty green, but it works. And then I can paint those side by side and then blend them together. So I would start with my yellow, add my green, and then go back and add the blue, And then when my brush is cleaned out and fairly dry, I can go back and smooth that out. So mixing on your tray, mixing on the paper, either one is fine. Like I said, sometimes you might want to start with a pre-mixed color on your tray, colors that you need instead of straight colors, and then to this blending technique on the canvas. And the very last technique I'm going to show you is the wet in wet, like watercolor wet in wet. If I want it to spread out and be a little bit more flowy, I can do that. I can start with an undercolor painting if I want. So here I'll put a little bit of red down, and then I will let that dry. I put a little bit of water into it just because I wanted it to be a little thinner. Don't put too much water in with paint, especially acrylic, because acrylic paint has binding agents in it, and the binding agent will break down when it has too much water. So be aware of that, and sometimes it'll crackle, not when you want it to. So I have my red under base. I'm just going to let that dry. And now that that is dry, I'm going to take clean water. Make sure that you are using clean water for this. I'm going to get it fairly wet, and since this paint is dry, it's not going to move or come up anymore, so pretty wet. Be careful, your paper might buckle a little bit. And now I'm going to take some of my paint, I'll just use the blue on top. I'm actually going to water that paint down quite a bit, get it really watery, and then I can drop that in just like I did with watercolor, and it's going to spread out and create a much more watercolor technique. So if I wanted to do a texture on top or mix a couple of colors and make it look a little bit more watercolory, start with an underpainting color, get it wet, and then really water down the paint and drop that in. And these are the acrylic painting techniques that I would like you to practice in your sketchbook. When you have completed them, make sure that you're taking a photograph of them and uploading them to the Google Classroom. Thank you. Don't forget to wash out your brushes.